Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the second panel on today's event on crafting revolutions. So this panel is on revolutionary bodies, and we have four amazing presentations to listen to. So the first is by Charlie Xie, who is a major in Africana Studies and Science, Technology, and Society. Charlie's paper is entitled Grappling Culture: How the Black Panther Party Addressed Colonial and Urban Anxieties Through Martial Arts. And I should say before we begin that we'll hear all four of the presentations and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So hold on to your questions and we'll have time to discuss them. Charlie, go ahead.
Great. Well, my name is Charlie, and I'm a senior majoring in history of science and Africana studies. One of my primary interests is the history of African-American political activism, particularly from 1950s to the 1970s. Inspired and nurtured by the Pan-Africanist tradition here at Penn, and my precursors such as W.B. Du Bois and Tukufu Zuberi, I am interested in Black internationalism, including but not limited to Afro-Asian solidarity. My research project focuses on the Black Panther Party's practice of martial arts and its representation in the party newspaper. I think there is something really special about the practice of martial arts, special enough that the party was willing to consistently promote it in its propaganda machines, namely the Black Panther Party newspaper. Specifically, I ask, what does it mean for a Black nationalist organization to adopt and promote Asian cultural practice? How did martial arts supplement and complicate the party's political affiliation with Communist China? Did the party's program shape martial arts element in hip hop and African American culture in general? These very questions serve as a critique of Eurocentrism in Gilroy's The Black Atlantic and challenges conventional understandings of racial and gender divide. Sylvia Winter writes that the task of Black studies should be that of rewriting knowledge and disrupting what Lisa Lowe calls the colonial division of humanity. Inheriting these intellectual visions, my research focused on Black agency and the processes of self-making, as Edmund T. Gorgon articulates. It is a self-erasure project, while not trivializing sectarian conflicts, attempts to unveil the interconnectedness of libertarian agendas and the intimacies of human nature. The Black Panther Party was founded in Oakland, California by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton to students at Merritt College in October 1966. Dissatisfied with American imperialism and racism, the Black Panther Party viewed its cause as part of the larger international decolonization struggle. Huey Newton writes in The Black Panther that African Americans are consistently inflicted with brutality from the occupying army embodied in the police department. This is a great similarity between the occupying army in Southeast Asia and the occupying of our communities by the racist police. Unlike the mainstream civil rights activists of its time, the Black Panther Party did not seek recognition or protection from the American government. On the contrary, it rejected the legitimacy of the racist American government and attempted to create self-sustaining communities for underprivileged African Americans. Despite significant police repression, the Black Panther Party had opened offices in 68 cities from Winston-Salem to Omaha and Seattle by 1970. Beyond its domestic importance as the center of a revolutionary movement in the United States, the party had international influences as a Marxist-Leninist group that supported the cause of Third World Revolutionary forces. Not only did the party have an embassy building in Algeria, the Black Panther Party delegation, including Huey Newton and Tolbert Small, went to China and were honored as national guests in September 1971. The Black Panthers' domestic and international influence challenged white capitalist hegemony in the United States and became a major target of police surveillance and oppression. J. Edgar Hoover, the former director of FBI, infamously stated that the Black Panther Party, without question, represented the greatest threat to internal security of the country. In addition to the frequent harassment and infiltration, the FBI's counterintelligence program attempted to isolate the Black Panther Party, create internal conflicts within the party, and vilify the party's public image. Recognize the incredible diversity of martial arts, this paper uses the term martial arts as an all-inclusive term because it is one used by the Black Panther Party. Much like this paper, the party was not interested in distinguishing and separating traditional styles of martial arts around the world. In fact, its newspaper, The Black Panther, laments that most students, instead of arriving at their natural potentials are confined within the structural binds of a chosen system or style. In other words, the conformity to a particular systems or styles was not as important as the efficacy of martial arts to the Panthers. On the other hand, strict adherence to traditional practices were sometimes inaccessible. At the Oakland Community Learning Center, where the Black Panther Party provided free martial arts lessons, there was no emphasis placed on students acquiring expensive uniforms or other equipments because most of the students were unable to afford them. Although the Black Panther Party uses the symbol of yin and yang in the headline of its section on martial arts, the martial arts practiced by the Black Panther Party were not mere continuations of Eastern traditions. Existing literature notes that the Black Panther practiced Tiger-style Taekwondo, a system developed by Ken Yoon in California and practiced widely throughout Berkeley and Oakland. Understanding the realities of street fights, Yoon incorporated multiple hand techniques to supplement the traditional Taekwondo, which heavily used kicking techniques. By adopting a contemporary style that suited the environment in which the Panthers lived, the party demonstrated both adaptability and practicality. The martial arts section of the party newspaper, however, makes no mention of Tiger-style Taekwondo, but has columns dedicated to different martial arts styles, including Bendo, Aikido, and Xingyi. Since the martial arts column also stated that the Panthers and children practice Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee, my analysis of the party newspaper supplements existing literature and shows that the party was interested and practiced a wide range of martial arts styles. However, the Black Panther Party's general obsession with Asian cultural practices did risk fetishizing the Orient. Edward Said, in his groundbreaking work Orientalism, proposes that the developing and maintenance of every culture requires the existence of another different and competing outer ego. To the United States, Communist Asia epitomized the different and competing ego as a demographically, politically, and economically different entity, and was considered to be an existential threat by the United States. African Americans were not foreign to this kind of alienation and demonization. Perceived as the other in the white-dominated America, African Americans have a long history of seeking alternatives overseas. From Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X, some African Americans did not see advancement of Black people within the existing social structure as the best way to uplift the living conditions of African Americans. The Black Panther Party represented another example of such a sentiment. Advocating for Black power and Black nationalism, the Black Panther Party embodied otherness and aimed to create otherness. Its martial arts program could be understood in the context of Orientalism, but unlike the global North who orientalized Asia to discriminate and subjugate, the Black Panther Party orientalized Communist Asia to appropriate and fetishize. Without recognizing the limitation of Communist Asia, such as human rights violations during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 in China, the Black Panthers' blind worship of Mao arguably was a form of fetishization. Praising the Communist Asia was ultimately self-serving for the Black Panther Party because it showed that its radical political agenda was viable. Contemplating the party's interest in martial arts in the context of Orientalism and how the party interacted with Asian otherness as Black otherness is essential in understanding why the Black Panther Party showed particular affinity with Asian cultural practices and in questioning the sincerity of the party's interest in them. The Black Panther Party's fetishization or over-romanticization of Communist Asia also had complicated ramifications. While the inability to provide a comprehensive or truthful account of Communist China condoned human rights violations, the Black Panther Party's romanticization of China did to a certain extent challenge the American construction of racism against Asians. During the Cold War, America orientalized Asians and Asian Americans communities as the evil other. The American pro-war, pro-capitalist political orthodoxy coaxed African Americans to orientalize Asians and reject solidarity with Asian communities. The Black Panther Party's praises of Communist Asia were challenging the stereotypical and racist Orientalism constructed by the dominant Cold War mentality, although the party arguably was orientalizing Communist Asia on the other end of the political spectrum. It is important to note that Communist China was also appropriating African American struggles for civil rights. Once again, one could question the sincerity of Afro-Asian solidarity when China mainly used the discrimination and oppression of African Americans to criticize the United States government and Western capitalism in general. Mao argued that the civil unrest following the assassination of MLK was a new clarion call to all the exploited and oppressed people of the United States to fight back against the barbarous rule of the monopoly capitalistic class. To a certain extent, Mao was appropriating the civil rights movement, considering the mainstream of the movement in the United States was not about overthrowing capitalism. Perhaps more egregiously, Communist China also objectified African-American activists and reduced them to testimony of the superiority of Chinese communism. Vicky Garvin, an African-American political activist who taught English and African-American history at the Shanghai Foreign Language Institute, for instance, was compelled to locate writing more agreeable with the CCP's political line when she taught African-American history. Such a blatant appropriation of African-American political activism showcased that the Black Panther Party was not alone in orientalizing or appropriating Asian culture. It was a part of the larger social network of how different actors on the international stage viewed each other, learned from each other, vilified each other, and stereotyped each other for their own interest. Cultural practices such as martial arts should not be peripheral additions to academic discourse surrounding the political activism of the Black Panther Party. They offer a pathway to understand the party's relationships with Communist Asia and Asian Americans. What sets the Black Panther Party's practice of martial arts apart from a single cultural exchange is that such a cultural practice is formed under the background of colonialism. Members of the Black Panther Party view themselves as colonized subjects within the United States, and their orientalization of Asian culture conveyed an aspiration to separate from the white racist America and to identify with all people of color in the global South. Such a worldview, when promoted through the martial arts section of the party newspaper, is a racial project that attempted to redefine African-American lives and their expected relationship with Asian and Asian Americans. Consistent with the party's racial project in the context of sickle cell anemia, its racial project in the context of martial arts programs relied on a hypervisibility of Black vulnerability and Black resilience. Countering the racist stereotypes that Black people are sickly and angry, the martial arts program is an attempt to rewrite a narrative and present the Panthers as vigorous, capable, and composed individuals. Linking the martial arts program with success is a racial project that defines participation in the survival programs and radical political activism by extension as a desirable and respectable trait. The Black Panther Party's racial project in the case of martial arts conveys the party's understanding of an ideal Blackness that centers on community engagement, political activism, and healthy lifestyle. For the Black Panther Party, practicing martial arts is a practical necessity that enabled the party to simultaneously promote third-world solidarity based on the commonality of being underprivileged. The first martial arts column of the Black Panther Party states that although in each country at different times and through many people, new systems appeared, the aim of each have a common point. Each system aimed at delivering answers to questions about individuals and mankind. Each system presented one road toward learning and living in harmony with others. With respect to martial arts, this section is reiterating previous discussion of the multi-style nature of the party's martial arts. With respect to political movements, this section is establishing a political solidarity with third world decolonization struggles through recognizing a common hate of colonialism and racism and a common love of freedom and justice. Combined together, perhaps the Black Panther Party saw practicing martial arts as a way to establish political solidarity and learn to live in harmony with others. Because the party practiced and was solely interested in Asian martial arts, this others in the context of martial arts programs is Asian. In other words, the Black Panther Party's martial arts program, in addition to being one that emphasizes Black resilience, is also a racial project that promotes Black internationalism and Afro-Asian solidarity. If the party newspaper in general constructs an imagined community of revolutionaries, its martial arts section specifically served to construct and imagine communities of Black and Asian kinship, both politically and culturally. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Charlie. Our second presenter is Sergio Emilio Carballido, who is majoring in religious studies and mathematical economics. And Sergio's paper is entitled La Santa Muerte, A Revolution to Mexico's Popular Religiosity and Its National Identity.
Work well. Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm happy to see a lot of faces here. Thanks for coming. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and also that maybe you get interested in some more topics about Mexico and popular culture. So my project is called La Santa Muerte, A Revolution to Mexico's Popular Religiosity and Its National Identity. Let me tell you a story. Outside of the Mexico City subway, Tepito station, there is an infamously known Barrio Bravo fierce neighborhood, Tepito, a place with one of the biggest counterfeit and open-air markets in the city. Here, a couple of streets away from the market, thousands of people gather on the first day of each month to pay homage and worship a skeleton figure identified as La Santa Muerte, the Saint Death, also known as La Niña Bonita, La Flaca, La Niña Blanca, among other names. The female deity, unrecognized by the Catholic Church, has attracted thousands of followers in the last few decades. Some authors, such as Andrew Chestnut, estimate the number of worshippers to be around 5 million people, while others are more conservative and give estimates of over 1 million. But regardless of the actual number, it is undeniable that the cult of La Santa Muerte has attracted more followers. Around 20 years ago, former quesadilla vendor Enriqueta Romero, usually known as Doña Queta, the picture in the left, decided to put a figure of La Santa Muerte outside of her house to show her devotion to the divinity. Surprisingly, people started to gather outside of her public shrine, showing that what was a seemingly hidden and small cult was a growing movement. New shrines have been opened all across Mexico, and even they have been now in places with a small number of Latinx communities in the United States, such as in Virginia. Who is the Saint Death? What is the origin of the saint? And how do people interact with her? These questions could seem trivial if we don't acknowledge the importance that this figure has in allowing us to understand the changes in popular religiosity in Mexico. In a country where violence has increased in the last few decades due to the war against narco-traffic, along with hard economic crises such as the 1994 tequila crisis, the role of the Catholic Church and its saints is challenged in a historically Catholic country by the rise of cults like the Saint Death, Santeria, and other forms of Christianity. What does this tell us about the needs and beliefs of people in Mexico? I explored to what extent La Santa Muerte is a revolution to popular religiosity in Mexico, and I analyzed why people worship the Saint Death, his uniqueness in comparison to other saints, and its history. So when I told my friends and family about my research, there was this common assumption that the Saint Death was a cult exclusive of people who asked her for dangerous and immoral favors. Its associations to delinquency and the underworld come first to the mind. People warned me about the risk of visiting Tepito, and they immediately assumed that the followers of the Saint Death were thieves or narcos who asked for protection and harm from their enemies. It's common that people associate her with the Antichrist, the satanic, and the occult. At the beginning of my research, I thought that it reflected the decay of Catholicism as a new opposing force to the millenary Catholic Church. However, in Tepito, I found a different perspective that makes me argue that the saint is not opposed to Catholicism, but rather that its current qualities are a result of popular Catholic beliefs. The picture on the left shows Tepito subway station. The picture on the right is part of evidence found in a police seizure. These type of images are very popular in media and enhance mental associations that people have of the Saint Death with dangerous people. Although La Santa is in fact venerated extensively in prisons and has been found in properties of famous narcos, the people who visited the shrine didn't look or do anything too different from what could be seen in a church. As Pansters mentions, La Santa Muerte cult was founded on requests for protection and attempts to secure love or achieve various desires. Historically, she has appeared continuously in the films of ethnographers of the 20th century as the Saint Death of love magic, emphasizing the role of the skeleton saint's role as a love doctor, especially among women. So when I went in the shrine, people were lighting candles, they were praying, taking pictures, and buying amulets. The picture on the left is the exterior of the shrine. Inside, we can see the saint. And well, imagine that this is in a common neighborhood, and this used to be just a place where Doña Queta used to sell quesadillas. So the most striking thing I saw was a woman who was smoking a cigarette and drinking some tequila to show gratitude to the dead, leaving both things on the altar after taking some sips. These practices are very interesting as they show the religious syncretism in the same death and the heavy influence of Catholicism. Some Catholic Church representatives have even declared the call of the same death as satanic, and even the Pope said that he was worried about the new cults of the death that are gaining popularity in Mexico. However, among practitioners, there seems to be a consensus that the same death is not against Catholicism. In the shrine, it was common to hear the Lord's Prayer, and Doña Queta, she mentioned in an interview, is a strong believer in God. According to her, God is above everything, even above the same death, who only has some say in the worldly matters of people. This syncretism is clearly seen in the types of rituals and prayers that people do to worship the same death. As described by Chestnut, the spell of love involves some prayers, the creation of an amulet using palos de unión, binding sticks, and the use of rose petals. Roses are widely associated with Our Lady of Guadalupe, and they are frequently left in churches to ask for favors from the Virgin. The palos de unión are used prominently in love spells by practitioners of Santeria and Voodoo. Another example of this syncretism is the incorporation of the rainbow candle as an element of worship. This is probably based on the Seven Powers, Siete Potencias candle of Santeria, Cuba's main African-derived religion. This type of candle is spread not only in the sainted cult. On one of my visits to the Catholic Church of St. Hippolytus in Mexico City, I found a 7-color candle below the statue of St. Jude. The image on the right is the candle I'm talking about. And if you go to a church in Mexico, you might see a few of them. And well, on the left, we can see like someone smoking next to the same death. So apart from the saints' associations with Santeria, the cult shows signs of indigenous and strong Catholic influence. The use of tobacco is predominant in many native cultures, where many healing rituals use tobacco as an instrument of purification. On the other hand, Catholicism gives the framework that the cult uses to operate. The monthly rosary at Doña Queta's shrine is a modified version of the Catholic prayer. As Chestnut says, given that the great majority of Santamuertistas were raised in a Catholic environment and continue to identify themselves as Catholics, it's not surprising that they draw heavily on their pre-16 ritual repertoire in addressing the main object of their religious devotion. In the Rosary, as in the Novena, the pretty girl is the protagonist. However, God, Jesus, and Mary play supporting roles, with the Hail Mary, Lord's Prayer, and Glory Be. Instead of asking the Virgin for help, worshippers ask the Pretty Lady, open quotes, with you I go, most holy death, and I live trusting in your power. I leave you having been helped and knowing that my soul would return safely. Come with me everywhere and never leave me alone. And since you already protect me like a true mother, have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit bless me. Amen. Catholicism is the most important influence the cult relies on. La Santa has transformed Mexico popular religiosity by adapting herself to the predominant Catholic framework. She is conceived as an archangel of death who only obeys God. For devotees, she substitutes a similar role to Archangel Michael as the one who judges souls, indigenous and Santeria, as the one who judges souls. Indigenous and Santeria influences in the cult are evident. However, those are not exclusive, and they are also common in Catholic practice in Mexico. People might not smoke cigarettes in front of the Virgin Mary. However, it is common that they leave roses, food, and letters, and use the saints as protection amulets in a similar manner to the way that they use the Saint Death figure. Therefore, the Saint Death is not an opposition to Catholicism, but rather a transformation within its own framework. One of the main figures behind the call of the dead was David Romo. Before being involved in legal issues, Romo was known as a priest. He opened his saint-based church, known officially as Iglesia Santa Católica Apostólica, Mexico, United States, in an attempt to unify the cult of the Saint Death. He started to conduct exorcisms, liberation masses, and healing services as a way of integrating charismatic Christianity into his Santa Muerte cult. You can see the image on the right, where we can see the Saint Death next to a Catholic figure. Romo knew that the integration of both practices was a good way to increase the number of followers of his church, showing that the call of the Saint Death attracts more people when it gets closer to Catholic roots. This explains why outside of Doña Queta's shrine, thousands of devotees approach the shrine on their knees, in the same way some Catholics arrive at the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So what's the benefit of worshiping the saint? Within Catholic framework, worshiping the Saint Death provides material benefits instead of transcendental ones. The Saint Death follows a practical religion approach where worshippers aim for material benefits. Christ pardons your sins in the afterlife. La Santa Muerte solves your problems in the material life. This is reinforcing an interview by Sabina Berman to Doña Queta when she asked her about her belief in God and in Catholicism. Doña Queta replies, La Santa Muerte provides you with paros. As anthropologist Claudio Lovnis described, paro, in Mexican slang, is similar to the Mexican legal injunction amparo, which is used as a legal protection under legal prosecutions, or the right to protection and effective remedy. This contrasts to the religion's notions of amparo, which implies the transcendental salvation that can be provided by the Virgin Mary. Leibniz describes it this way: salvation in the Santa Muerte cult is no longer transcendental. It is temporary, transitory, and precarious. Being wedded to La Santa Muerte appears to me to be an act of accepting a life with some possibilities for respite, but no redemption. Christensen describes this idea by describing the relationship between followers and La Santa Muerte. She remarks that it resembles a marriage contract more than a short-lived commercial contract. Her emphasis on La Santa Muerte as providing paros is helpful in this regard, because a paro is a temporary form of help, and a doc form of aid designed to rescue someone who is in a tight spot, but not to transform his or her normal situation. Death is thus not in a position to effect an ontological life change. It is not a figure of redemption, but of intervention. La Santa Muerte is the universal lawyer, the one who does paros and deals with concerns about material life. Worshippers ask her for a wide variety of things, like money and love, to having success in something or being protected from death. All of these things share a material component. So Flores Martos includes the anecdote of an architect, a middle-class man who was with his friends in a beach house. Everyone was going to swim in the pool, but he didn't want to. Hours later, he confessed he had got a tattoo of the same dead in his back when he was going through a very hard moment in his life. Flores Martos uses this anecdote to make the point that the Santa Muerte cult is no longer relegated to prisons, prostitutes, and the criminal world, but rather touches sectors of society, as this architect, whose livelihood can be characterized as precarious. They recognize the Santa Muerte cult as founded first and foremost on transactions and exchanges that prominently feature requests for protection, and secondarily, interventions to secure love or achieve various other desires. The same death cult can be analyzed as including a stigma. As Erving Goffman discusses, the stigma can be both a visible or at least discoverable individual handicap and an exalted sign of trivial pride. Indeed, there is a connection between stigma and the sacred. The mark of personal suffering can become a sign of allegiance with that which cannot be profaned. There are other people who are not like the architect, who wear the branded image on their neck or forearm, making the stigma permanently visible, and thereby they reduce their chances to circulate freely in formal middle-class jobs and circles, while gaining in exchange protection from those who fear the tit of tat, jealous reciprocity that characterizes La Santa Niña. There is a trade-off that worshippers have to assume. The high cost that worshiping the saint that represents has to be overpassed by the benefit worshippers receive. Identifying yourself with the same death might be embarrassing, but it provides you with personal and social benefits, such as belonging to certain groups. And this is especially true in the case of prisons. On the left image, we can see St. Hippolytus Church, better known as St. John Thaddeus Church, as every month there is a mass in his name. Some years ago, streets would be closed due to the high number of people that would come. When I went to the church, I got my shoes shined with the man in front of it, who has been working there for over 40 years. I asked him some questions about his job, religion, and how things have changed in the city. He declared that he was Catholic because of his family, that he has never been a strong believer, but he told me that now nothing big happens in front of the church. He said, "We're lucky people even come. People aren't believing as much as they used to," he said. St. Jude, as the saint of lost causes, used to be the saint Catholics would go in very hard situations. However, this doesn't longer occur as much. People are looking for alternatives like the same death, perhaps due to some disenchantment with Catholicism. However, as I argued along this essay, I don't think this means to stop. This means that they stop to be Catholic. The same death operates mainly under a Catholic framework. But what makes this belief so powerful? I think that it's a matter of anti-institutionalization. The failure of institutions in Mexico. Leibniz argues that the development of popular Mexican religion is a symptom of Mexico's second circular revolution, the nation's increasingly tenuous connection to the state. I would argue further and claim that the failure of institutions in Mexico is what makes the saint death so popular. La Santa is an anti-institutional figure, and the success of the cult relies on that. That explains why Romo's attempt to institutionalize the church failed. Through institutionalization, the cult progressively loses its personalized experience and becomes part of a rigid system of rules and things people are supposed to do, reducing the personal benefit and the degree of freedom that people have on worshiping the saint. Despite of Catholic opposition and the negative stigma, it is a fact that La Niña Blanca is expanding steadily around Mexico and the United States. As the cult grows, there are more attempts to institutionalize it. However, its power relies in its flexibility of the cult and their niche and highly committed community. Therefore, it is still to be seen if La Santa will be able to inspire and protect more people, and if there will be successful attempts to institutionalize the cult.
Great, thank you. So our third presenter is Hertha Torre Gallego, a health and societies major and a major in Hispanic studies, whose presentation is titled A Partial Revolution, Engaging with Realities of Abortion Reform in Argentina.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Hertha Torre, and I am a senior at Penn, here to present my honors thesis research titled Abortion Revolution, Engaging with Realities of Abortion Reform in Argentina. The motivation for this research dates back to December of 2020, when Argentina became the second democratic country in Latin America to legalize abortion. Law 27610 allowed pregnancies to be terminated through the first 14 weeks of pregnancy, which was seen as a huge win coming from a legacy of major reproductive rights demonstrations in the last few decades, including massive feminist protests and mobilizations in the streets of Buenos Aires and other larger cities in Argentina, which for many signaled the country's final definite step towards gender equality and reproductive equity. However, such a revolution feels somewhat partial when understood through the social and real-life experiences of women, children, and abortion-seeking patients on the ground who are actually contending with the human response to this social change. My personal experience in Argentina expands over the last 2 summers, through which I interned. I collaborated with SADES, which is a nonprofit organization with a focus on public health and education-related interventions in the outskirts of Buenos Aires, and who works particularly with vulnerable populations in a town called Pilar, which I will talk about shortly. My time in Argentina made me really question the interaction between medical practitioners, young women, and this new policy that was being passed and seen internationally as a huge revolution, but that internally the implementation on the ground was seeking and just asking for a lot more than it was actually happening. The goal of this project is to bring a more personal and detailed account of abortion and family planning, bridging the current research gap related to Argentina's abortion policy and providing a clearer picture of family planning uptake in low-income, low-resource communities. You might be asking why this research is important. I'm going to show you a couple graphs to hopefully convince you that this is something that was worth studying. We can see on screen that although slowly decreasing rates of adolescent pregnancy and fertility, as well as maternity repetition, lack of access to sexual and reproductive health, etc., are still very high drivers of inequality and socioeconomic differences in Argentina. As we see on screen, you can see Argentina as the blue line, in between El Salvador on top and the US in orange, sorry. And as you can see, even though Argentina now has an even more progressive abortion policy than the US has, it very much mirrors El Salvador very, very closely, which El Salvador, if you're not familiar, has an extremely restrictive abortion policy. It's also worth mentioning some data from the Guttmacher Institute that approximates that out of all pregnancies in Argentina, or all teenage pregnancies in Argentina from 2015 to 2020, almost 60% of those were unintended. And out of all these unintended pregnancies, almost half ended in abortion, right? And so this shows that people are somehow seeking these abortions. People want and are really engaging in this medical practice, but it's just that it's not really reaching that fertility data that we were just looking at. And so this leads us to what my research is really focused on, which these are my 2 research questions. The first one kind of explored the relatively limited change to fertility rates in early motherhood in vulnerable populations, despite the legitimization and expansion of abortion in Argentina. And more broadly, my research really questions the sociocultural, historical, and anthropological roots that lead us to understand abortion and particularly motherhood in this country. How I achieved this was through 5 weeks of ethnographic fieldwork in Pilar, which is a small town outside of Buenos Aires. This small town has about 300,000 inhabitants, and it's known through its increasingly upscale profile due to the development of gated communities and country clubs, although 51% of its population lives under the poverty line. Additionally, I think it's worth noting that the population density within Pilar varies a lot, which I think speaks to its socioeconomic status. It varies from like 154 inhabitants to 2,570 inhabitants per square kilometer, sorry, which again showcases the difference in like low-resource housing, crowded living spaces, and the kind of low-income communities that I was particularly working with. Throughout my time there, I conducted research at 3 different sites, primary health center, which is representative of a typical public local primary clinic where Argentinian families go for regular checkups, immunizations, and treatments for common illnesses. A maternal hospital where most local women give birth, and then the International Political Science Association Conference, which happened to be in Buenos Aires while I was there, and it was really interesting in getting a more academic and activist-focused view of this topic. I interviewed a total of 36 subjects, along with general subject observation in both sites. And this also included 2 weekly workshops with local families and professionals through SADES, the nonprofit that I was partnering with, which was part of also my ethnographic research. Once I returned from Argentina, I transcribed and translated all my interviews and used thematic coding to get to my results. And so to provide a little more insight into this research, I will walk you through one of my interviews live. I met Rocío during my first visit to Argentina, that first summer that I was there. She's a 23-year-old Argentinian mother who has 4 children aged 10, 4, 8, and 1, respectively. She is currently unemployed and did not graduate high school because she had to drop out of school at age 14. I think it's useful to understand the context in which a young woman becomes or chooses to become a mother, which is one of the big themes of my project. Because at the center of this life experience, we really understand, we need to understand that this whole community lives in this idea of generational poverty. Generational poverty is at the center of this life experience. And if we start on the far left of the diagram, we encounter early motherhood, right? Which is what Rocío kind of experienced at age 13. I will have to say, and as I will explain later, this was a choice that she made, obviously very involved by her surroundings, but that led her to then have to drop out of high school at age 13 to be able to take care of not only her baby, but also like, you know, she has 6 siblings. So like her mom couldn't take care of her and her baby and her other 6 siblings. And so she was kind of forced to drop out of high school and able to take care of her kid, which led to a limited education, which then led to very constrained job opportunities, which in turn just leave us with a very diminished and social and economic capital that of course doesn't allow her to have a job, doesn't allow her to have the skills to be able to get a job, and fully occupies her with her kids, which 10 years later, you know, she has 4 kids, the youngest one being a little toddler. My thesis ultimately explores how in this context, how in Rocío's life, poverty, pronatalism, life-framing institutions, and this idea of what constrains and what makes up this autonomous decision, idealize motherhood while consistently perpetuating this precariousness and generational poverty. Thinking through the choice of becoming a mother and taking on motherhood, is this really based on personal agency? Is the decision to not have an abortion or reject this practice based on the social actors pushing through these decisions? And so talking about my 3 main key findings, the first one is based on motherhood, this idea of motherhood as a life project. Soon after I started my interviews, of course, initially my project was very much focused on abortion and why weren't these women accessing abortions and what was really happening in the abortion landscape in Argentina. But I found that the topic of abortion was easily shifting towards ideas and understandings of motherhood. This is a key aspect that represents how motherhood is integrated into the social fabric of young women aged 12 and up, particularly in Pilar. And many mothers actually refer to motherhood's irreplaceable value, this idea that it added to their personal identity and empowerment. And we have a couple of quotes here that explain this. One 17-year-old mother explained to me how, quote, "Sometimes I think she," mentioning her baby, "gives me more love than I give her. Before my pregnancy, I was always alone, and now I have her. My world is complete and at peace." This kind of shows that motherhood, womanhood, identity are all shifting and mixing towards one defining time during adolescence. I argue that the idea of motherhood as a life project drives many of these young women to childbearing in a context of scarce resources, making motherhood the most desired life project that these women have access to, and thus the life project that they choose. The interviews also showcase how institutional support, or rather lack of, during this transition to motherhood translates into heavily internalized stigma and difficulty when offering family planning services. This raises certain questions. So in this context, is motherhood a legitimate choice of a life project? Is motherhood really a choice in these situations at all? Is it something these women are thrown into, or is it something that they're actively making a choice to pursue? one of the doctors that I met with explained this extremely clearly in the second quote that I have up on screen. Quote, "They desire ownership of a piece of their life, which in their circumstances, they can only achieve through a baby. It gives them a sense of authority that they have not had before," which I think really very well explains this idea of motherhood as a life project. Another key finding of this study was the role that medical practitioners play in implementing the policy at large. The idea of conscientious objection, which is implemented in this policy and kind of written down in the actual piece of legislation that was passed through Congress, explains how there's a right for doctors and medical practitioners to abstain from participating in abortion procedures through personal and moral beliefs. Throughout my time in Argentina, without knowing so, I was able to actually interview two conscientious objectors that worked at this primary health clinic. And they really emphasize this idea that a lot of it comes from their personal and moral beliefs, which is something that you can't really contradict, but it's something that's so prevalent on, and it's so deep rooted into Argentina's culture and Argentina's experience and relationship to religion, that is something that you can't really move past. A lot of these doctors explain that when the policy was first passed in December 2020, in some or most hospitals, 90 to 100% of the doctors that were there were conscientious objectors, and they didn't really want to leave their job, their hospital, because they had to, provide these abortions, and so they didn't. So we were faced with this idea that there's a lot of women that might want an abortion, might reach out to the clinic for an abortion, but they might be constrained by the doctor that they're placed with in order to be able to even consider the choice of an abortion. So I think we have to keep in mind that a lot of these times, there's a lot of social hierarchies at place that are really disencouraging women that might even take that step into, okay, I'm going through this process and I'm interested in pursuing this. They might detract them from that as well. And then lastly, my time in Pilar really showcased a very prominent urban and rural divide, which I think was pretty evident from what I expected coming in. A lot of these protests and social demonstrations have been mostly happened in Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires, which is a huge urban city. But then when I arrived at Pilar, which is mostly, at least the areas that I was in was mostly rural, I saw that the sort of activism that was seen in the city was kind of counterparted with a lot of very limited degrees of engagement. And one of the activists that I actually talked to quoted, there's still a lot of information that is missing. Lots of women do not know to this day that abortion is a real, safe, affordable, and legal option, which is really incredible because you see, at the time of legalization, you saw these huge headlines on international newspapers and media that showcase how this was a huge revolution for women's rights, when in reality, you really see the on the ground work, and it's really almost shocking to see that a lot of these women aren't even familiar with the green wave or things that are very prominent in Western feminism and how the abortion policy was passed, particularly in Argentina. And then to conclude and to give you a few takeaways from this project, as a federalist system with heavily fragmented healthcare, many of the inequities that we have seen in Argentina over my presentation and over the past few decades actually predate the abortion law. A lot of it comes from challenges that need to be addressed, and there's this intermingling of individuals, institutions, and environments that is really central to how we understand policies, not only on paper but also the way in which they're implemented. It's also worth noting that my project is not only localized within Pilar. I obviously had a small sample, but it's not only localized within the stories of these women in Pilar, but it also showcases systemic patterns of inequality across the world. And it really makes us think about the underlying factors between these situations and the actual comprehensive solutions that we can put forward. Which brings me to my last point, which is this idea of compromise, frustration, and failure. These are three words that I encountered time and time again throughout my research throughout the past year, and have really led me to believe that policy must not only be well-intentioned and well explained in paper and well passed through Congress and political institutions, but it also should be revolutionarily rooted in the realities and experiences of those who it aims to benefit. Finally, I want to thank the entities and fellowships that funded my research, my thesis advisors, and everyone here for paying attention to my presentation today. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And our last presenter is Dhivya Arasappan, who is a Health and Societies and Biology major. Divya's paper is titled A Climate Health Revolution, Examining Novel Framings of Climate Change as a Health Crisis.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So I started this project about almost a year and a half ago, and I came in with two kind of big ideas: climate change and health. And maybe many of you are wondering how these two things are connected, and that's something I was thinking about as well. And to get into that, I want to start with the story from, oops. Okay, cool. Beautiful. I want to start with the story from Carly Hampshire, who is a now resident who I interviewed as part of this project. And when she was a medical student, she founded what's now known as the Planetary Health Report Card. And when she was in medical school, one of the things that she noticed were the terrible wildfires in California. And she said, my very first year of medical school, there were terrible wildfires, as there are every year in California. But it was particularly bad my first year. We were in our pulmonary block at the time, and despite the fact that we were walking to class every day in N95 masks because the air quality was so bad, they didn't even mention the wildfires or the air pollution or anything at all related to the respiratory effects of the air we breathe. It felt like there was this massive disconnect between what is already happening with climate change and how health professionals are inherently not going to be prepared for it. And Carly Hampshire wasn't the only one thinking about this connection. As we'll see, there's many other health professionals, medical students, and physicians who are thinking about this intersection of climate change, medical education, and health, which I'll come back to towards the end of this presentation. But I want to take a step back to understand the climate and health movement and dig into this 2019 article from the New England Journal of Medicine. Here, emergency medicine physician Cecilia Sorensen and nephrologist Ramon Garcia Trabonino introduced the term climate medicine in this perspective piece. And they discussed the emergence of and rising death toll from chronic kidney disease of unknown origin, or CKDU. And while much remains unknown about this condition, it's believed to be closely related to heat exposure and dehydration. Experts believe it's a form of heat stress nephropathy that's in part due to rapidly changing environmental conditions. And Sorensen and Garcia Trabonino actually call CKDU a sentinel disease in the era of climate change. This article raises several questions for historians and sociologists of medicine. What is climate medicine? When and how did it emerge? And if there is a new era of climate medicine, what characterized an earlier era? And following this thread, I ask how and why physicians in the US have medicalized or institutionalized climate change as a health concern over the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, amidst the many opportunities and complexities of doing so. And here, the methods I utilized derive from anthropologist Joanna Crane's treatment of the emergence of global health science as an ethnographic object in her book, Scrambling for Africa. I reviewed medical journals from the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, conducted 13 open-ended, semi-structured interviews with healthcare professionals at various stages to understand what climate medicine looks like. I observed virtual climate and health webinars, conference proceedings, attended one in person on the day that New York turned orange from wildfire smoke, and also looked at materials here at KISLAC, which is probably one of my favorite parts. And in doing so, what I argue that medical students, physicians, and the medical community at large have utilized largely non-reductive approaches to address both the health consequences of climate change and climate change itself, from educating the public and policymakers to tackling upstream causes that affect patient health. And in doing so, they challenge traditional biomedical models of care from the clinic to the healthcare system at large, while relying on their scientific and medical expertise. This may seem like an obvious claim to some, but physicians did not locate the site of intervention of climate medicine in the individual body, a break from prior instances of medicalization, which constructed narrow conceptions of health and treatment. Here, I engage with medical sociologist Peter Conrad, who describes medicalization as a process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems, usually in terms of disease and illness. Moreover, medicalization can also describe the expansion of medical jurisdiction and authority to include these previously non-medical problems. And the key to understanding medicalization lies in how these problems are defined. Is the issue at hand framed in medical language, understood through the adoption of a medical framework, or treated with a medical intervention? On the other hand, medicalization also tends to focus on the source of the problem in the individual rather than the social environment, and calls for individual over collective or social solutions. And second, my use of the term non-reductive draws from Claire Wensland's discussion of the four major values that make up the term moral order, the moral order of biomedicine, from her book, A Heart for the Work, which is a study of medical education in Malawi. And these include reductionist rationality, authority over nature and the body, individualism, and technological orientation. And focusing in on this reductive rationality, she writes, practitioners perceive the empirical knowledge cumulatively produced by science through examination of ever smaller components of the body as evolving toward truth. She continues, what constitutes evidence to doctors, what prompts them to action, is visible or measurable dysfunction within the confines of the individual body. The site of their work is that same body. And so I'll show that the emerging field of climate medicine, the individual body, is not that site of intervention. Climate medicine locates a site of intervention in the upstream causes that affect patient health. There's two sections to this presentation, beginning with Physicians for Social Responsibility and an interesting narrative that takes us back to the 1960s. And then I'll turn to medical student activism today. This is a quick roadmap of what this next section will look like, and a couple key articles that have helped us understand where we can trace climate medicine and activism in this space back to. So as we see here, with Physicians for Social Responsibility, it started with this group of Boston doctors who set out to educate their colleagues, policymakers, and the general public about the disastrous consequences of nuclear power and weapons testing. And in doing so, they formed this group, PSR. And they published journal articles, books, and organized continuing medical education lectures around the country. And as we see here in a PSR recruitment pamphlet from the 1960s, they set out to get physicians politically involved in anti-nuclear war activism. And roles included providing scientific data in order to inform political decisions, educate fellow physicians, and get them involved in this serious exploration of these peaceful alternatives. If you listen carefully, those don't really sound like what physicians do, treating patients in a clinic. But they argue that the physician is charged with the responsibility for lives of his patients, the health of his community, and must begin to explore a new area of preventative medicine, the prevention of thermonuclear, chemical, or biological warfare. But what I find really interesting here as we delve into the medical consequences of thermonuclear war, this article published in 1962, is also how the role of the physician in anti-nuclear war activism has shifted from the 1940s to the 1960s. So physicians had typically eagerly taken on roles in disaster planning, and during the post-war period, there were many discussions of civil defense that appeared in medical journals. But by 1962, the founders of PSR started to push back against this role. And in this article, they outlined a scenario in which there's a 20-megaton atomic bomb that had been dropped on Boston, and they discussed the implications for disaster planning. And they said, while many assume that medical resources could meet demands that nuclear war imposes, they argue that physicians and others seriously underestimated the extent of death and destruction to be expected, and concerned about the vast degree of uncertainty posed by such a scenario, they basically said that any proposed disaster plan played a vast gamble with human lives, and conclude that physicians must work further upstream, not in disaster planning or civil defense, but in the prevention of thermonuclear war. They argue that physicians charged with the responsibility for the lives of their patients and the health of their communities must also explore this new area of preventative medicine. And so this thread of activism as preventative medicine is carried into the climate and health movement. And to this, we turn to Dr. Alexander Leaf. In 1989, he publishes this article titled The Potential Health Effects of Global Climatic and Environmental Changes, where he draws on existing climate science and detailed the health consequences of climate change, which have since served as entry points into mainstream climate discourse for healthcare professionals. And he also begins to outline a role for physicians and other health professionals in this space. Leaf talks about the evidence for these climate impacts on health, from how rising temperatures would increase mortality for infants and for elderly individuals, or how air pollution would exacerbate chronic conditions and respiratory diseases such as bronchitis, asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. He makes the argument that because climate change has disastrous health consequences, physicians must make it their concern. And he expands this jurisdiction of the medical profession quite liberally here, right, saying we've been educated and given a right by society to be the guardians of its health. And following this article, what we see in the late 1990s and early 2000s, physicians continued to develop connections between climate change and health, relying on work by climate scientists and applying, in some cases, their own specialized expertise. For example, in one JAMA article titled Some Like It Hotter, it reported on the substantial increase of tick-borne encephalitis in Sweden since the mid-1980s as a result of global warming, which had fostered an increasingly mild tick-friendly climate, connecting rising temperatures to the spread of vector-borne disease. And through the next decade and a half, there's an incredible number of these published medical articles that open new gates to understanding how climate change affects health. And like Leaf, many also echo this preventative medicine / public health framework under which healthcare professionals can adopt quote unquote non-traditional advocacy roles. And others considered involvement in global environmental policy as a natural extension of a growing ethos of preventative medicine, likening it to how preventative medicine has reduced smoking prevalence. And moving into some of the contemporary work that's happening today, I want to turn to these two examples. The first is Climate RX, which if you'd like, you can actually scan that QR code there. But their group, this was started by an emergency medicine physician out in Colorado during his fellowship. And he was thinking about how do we bring these conversations about climate change into the clinic? So based off of another model of a voting-based initiative that brought voting into the clinic, they basically had these badges that physicians had, and there was a QR code that said something like, "Do you want to learn about how climate change affects your health?" And so patients could scan that, and it would take them to a page that you guys can go to understand how climate change affects their health, but also actions that can be taken by themselves at a personal level and at a community level. And then the second example actually is about phasing out desflurane. Anesthesiologists like Jody Sherman and others have worked to phase out desflurane, which is a commonly used surgical anesthetic and a potent greenhouse gas in favor of other greener anesthetics. And where this comes from is actually the argument that the healthcare system has to cut its own emissions first and do no harm to patients. Because we see that because of climate change, patients are being affected coming into the clinic, into the emergency department with the various cases of heat stress and respiratory disease. So a large focus is actually reducing emissions, and one of these examples is phasing out desflurane. And these are two examples of kind of non-reductive interventions taken by physicians to address both the health consequences of climate change by educating patients in the clinic, as well as addressing climate change itself. And so for many, this is connected to a perspective of do no harm. And then for the remaining part of this presentation, I'll be digging into what medical students are doing today. So first, I'll say that the literature on medical socialization by historians and sociologists alike, like Samuel Bloom and Kenneth Ludmuir, has critically examined how medical education and training have impacted the development and choices of students as they become physicians. However, it's equally important to understand the ways in which medical students and trainees have in turn shaped and formed their education and training. So we can see here through this report card, which is what Carly Hampshire founded back when she was a medical student in 2019, that the medical school curricula has become an important site for enacting climate medicine. And this planetary health report card has emerged as a critical evaluative tool to grade institutions on measures of curricular integration and other opportunities for students to engage in climate change and planetary health, both inside and outside of the classroom, from education, research, talking about funding issues, and as well as campus sustainability. What becomes clear here, and in a couple of the narratives I'll share shortly, is that trainees are really interested in infusing climate change or integrating climate change into their curricula. And how this happens, I think, is really interesting. Rather than designating a separate block to, climate change and planetary health, they really see it as infusing it into a cardiology block or an endocrinology block into existing content. And that really takes a non-reductive approach to understanding kind of the systemic level issues that come with climate change, and overlaying it across existing curricula. So as we can see from one second-year medical student here, Margaret Bennett, she says that, sorry, to move back a little into this project, at this medical school, there was a team of students led by a professor, and they reviewed curricular material from the first 2 years of the preclinical curriculum to identify areas where, climate-related content can be inserted. And second-year medical students described this process as the least offensive way to do it, because you don't have time, you don't have to argue for more time or extra class. You just stick it into the stuff that's already there. And then the second thing I want to talk about in relation to the Planetary Health Report Card is how it's also expanded across international and state lines. So it started out in California, and from there, from one medical school, it went to 13 from the US and Canada. It went internationally to England and a couple other medical schools, as well as professions, including the nursing profession, physical therapy, and others. And what we see here is that there's a degree of adaptability that's been adopted. As Carly says here, the metrics were originally developed with the US context in mind. They're trying to be generalizable across the board. When we got Germany on board, they were saying that medical schools are not really research institutions. And so the entire research section was a little bit irrelevant. So we kind of just moved things around to make it acceptable to them. It's kind of been a hard balance between wanting to have every country and every medical school use the same metrics, but also recognizing that they're not always as relevant as they have been in the context that they were originally developed. But for the most part, we've been able to use the same metrics across the board, which really shows the adaptability of this Planetary Health Report Card as a tool for infusion and integration of climate and health content. Okay. This is just kind of my larger project, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this in the Q&A. But I think one of the big points that I've come across is how non-reductive physicians and medical students are approaching climate healthcare, climate medicine overall. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those wonderful presentations and for being so on time and organized. That was really impressive. I realized at the beginning I was so excited about the presentations that I didn't introduce myself. My name is Ramah McKay. I teach in the Department of History and Sociology of Science and in the Health and Societies program. And I am the moderator. So we have about 40 minutes for questions and conversation. And I thought maybe I could start by just offering a question that all of you or anyone who wants to can pick up. I was really struck in all the different projects that you did about the kind of how institutions appeared in each project, mostly as a site of inadequacy. Dhivya, you maybe were the most hopeful about the potential for institutional change. But so Charlie, I was thinking about your project and the way that the kind of refusal of the state and the rejection of the desire for recognition and the rejection of the kind of legitimacy of the state then posits the body as a site in which revolutionary potential and ideals and kind of the embodiment of these ideals can happen, as well as the embodiment of different ways of relating to different communities and different places. Sergio, I thought you showed really nicely how we can think about Catholicism as something that happens through embodied practices rather than just the church as a set of specific institutions. And there was that tension there. Hertha, you showed that this amazing legal transformation and transformation of the kind of legal framework plays out in kind of ambivalent and very partial ways in people's embodied experiences and kind of emotional desires and life projects. And then Dhivya, I thought you brought us back to the idea that we can also transform institutions and make them into spaces that foster both the political ideals that we want and the embodied experiences of health or well-being that we want. So I don't know if any of you would like to say more about the relationship between kind of revolution, institutions, and the body, whatever aspect of that as it comes out in your projects, but I would love to hear more.
Well, I guess I can say something about deficiencies, because deficiency is a so some people might not see it as so it's important to think about our standpoint, and my project standpoint, of course, is coming from a standpoint of reconciliation, of harmony. So I accept that kind of, accept that kind of biases that I potentially have about the project. But again, I don't think we, in the humanities, especially in the history of science, understand that objectivity is not really a thing.
Thank you.
There we go. I think this works. Sarah, let me know if it doesn't. I think personally, when thinking about institutions, this was something that I thought a lot about throughout my project. Thinking about, I think when we think about major changes, we mostly think about it in the legal sense, but I think how that kind of rainfalls into reality is one of the most important things, and where like a lot of things get lost usually in the process. I thought a lot about throughout my research about like informal and formal practices, which I think also relate to institutions. This idea that because it's not on paper doesn't mean that it's not happening on the ground. And I was really surprised. I know maybe my, Dhivya's was a little more positive. I know mine was maybe a little bit more on the fence about like how an institution might react to a situation like this. I was also able to like find a lot of doctors that we're like pushing for this change, and that we're really trying to engage in the informal practice that then can kind of like upstream into the formalization or, the legitimization of practices and institutions. So I think it goes both ways. But it is a great thing to think about, right? Like how the institution really like towers over the reality, and how we make sure that it goes both ways, and it doesn't only come from top down, but it also kind of like how bottom-up practices really can lead us to change, like Dhivya's, for example.
It's funny because when I started this project, or maybe like later in the project, I was kind of wondering, why hasn't climate and health happened earlier, right? Like we start in 1989 with Leaf's paper, and we see all these medical articles through the 1990s and then early 2000s, and people are writing, they're like, we need medical education on climate change. And it doesn't happen for the longest time. There's people in moments that are, integrating in whatever lecture material that they're teaching. Like, how does climate change affect dermatology, for example? I think there's one person at Penn who does that. But why does it take so long? Why was it in 2019 that we have the planetary health, the PHCR project come about? Why is there medical students for a sustainable future also comes about in 2019? So I think that is just a really interesting question of sometimes just the time it takes for movements and kind of these mini revolutions and even institutions to be built. I think also the fact that medical education, this project really looks at how medical students from the bottom up have targeted medical education as an important site for, activism. And this is not just with climate and health. I think you can go back to the environmental health movement of the 1970s. to kind of community health and community engagement in the 1960s is all examples of when medical students are really, really getting involved in targeting the curricula, targeting their education as an area for reform. And that's an incredibly important institution, as we see here. And I think a lot of my interlocutors and interviews have described that bottom-up process that's also turned in some ways traditional medical hierarchies on their head, which I think is fascinating to see, and also in partnership with their professors and other faculty. So yeah.
This working? Oh, okay. Yeah. I think I can add that one of the questions that arise from these projects is that we're all discussing in some way institutions and how are they created and how can they be modified. And I think an important insight is how institutions are made of people, right? And how through and there we have a question about agency as well, of how, to what extent can people modify an institution, and how sometimes it's done even without thinking about it, right? Like in my project, in the case of Catholicism, well, Catholicism, we might think that it's a very big institution that's not ever changing, but people are starting to do different things, and this not only happens there; it's also happening in Argentina when people start complaining about how abortion system is working. So I think then we have a question about agency and how we can change these institutions.
Well, we can open it up to the floor if people have questions for the presenters.
So I'm reading the question. The question is for Hertha. In countries such as the US and Ireland, secularization, i.e., a decline in traditional religious adherence, has been identified as a key factor in growing support for reproductive rights, particularly among younger generations. To what extent is this true of Argentina and of your research participants? Did your interviewees express a strong connection with religion, religious belief? If so, how do they relate to it or reconcile it with their support for reproductive rights? You also mentioned the role of conscientious objectors in the health system. Would you say they represent the majority of either the medical establishment or Argentinians? Or is this a case like the US, where because of politicization, the institutional outcomes have diverged from the preferences of the public?
Thank you. Two very interesting questions, very, very good observations of what this research was actually based on. The first one touching on religion and how more secular countries have moved towards, women's rights and abortion, more open abortion or more progressive abortion policies. This was kind of what really drove my research in the first place. Argentina is a deeply Catholic country, very much rooted in tradition and religion. And so when I saw that it became the second country in Latin America to really legalize abortion in a way that was extremely progressive to what the country really had shown up to then, that's what really pushed my research. And I was really wondering what had really informed that legislative change. Turns out that it was a lot of social interaction with, again, younger populations and demonstrations on the streets that, there was a lot of social change that then led that policy to be passed in Congress. But with regards to your question about, how the public in Argentina has taken on, I think it's a very divided, generally, again, in urban, I think this speaks to the rural-urban divide. In urban settings, there's a lot of understanding and not really objection at all towards abortion. It's something that people speak about freely and people openly react to it and engage with the reality that it is a choice. And at the end of the day, it's something that each abortion-seeking patient should choose to or not choose to engage with. But in the rural setting, which was really where my work was based in, I think that's one of the main things that I came in thinking it was going to be more prevalent than it would actually was. But I think it's not that people were very like extreme practitioners or like not practitioners, sorry, extreme like believers in Christianity. Rather, it was just something that was embedded in the culture and understandings that people just had generally of what it means to have a baby, what it means to, all these ideas about like abortion and anti-abortion sentiments and like what really constitutes a body and like a fetus and whatnot. That towards, your first question. The second question about the medical establishment, medical objection, contingent objectors, I think that was mostly aimed, again, has a lot to do with the culture and how the institutions have been established for so long. I think it was a real shock that this policy actually, like, it comes from years and decades of, and that's something that I touch on way more on my thesis than I did here, but I dedicate a whole chapter to how this policy came to be. And a lot of it comes from, again, social masses really inundating the streets of Buenos Aires and really going out and showing their support. But it actually had to be passed through, or it actually, Congress had to go through this policy, not once, but I think twice or three times almost for it to actually be passed. There was a lot of back and forth between the public and the political spheres, and a lot of debates within Congress that brought in not only doctors and people that were really like aiming for these abortions, but also a lot of anti-abortion social movements and people, institutions that really like spoke up when the time was right. And so with regard to contingent objection, I was really surprised by this. That was something that I really didn't expect, the problem to lay on the medical practitioner side, because coming from a country like the US, it's something that maybe it's not really touched upon, or is not something that you would imagine, like an abortion being stopped because the doctor doesn't believe that it should go through, at least in what I understood abortion being. And so I think a lot of it does go back to this idea of who holds the power in these spheres, particularly in the medical center. If you come in as a young woman requesting an abortion, but the doctor that you're faced with intersects this practice and tells you that that's not what you should be doing, you're obviously going to listen to that authority and that person in charge, particularly when you're uneducated and highly religious and already have so much going against the abortion. So yeah, all in all, it's a vast myriad of factors that really come together into actually, coming to the point where you request the abortion. Not only that, but also kind of end up going through it. I hope that answers the question.
Wonderful job, guys. So I have a question for all of you. So a few of you have said, and Hertha, you just said this, that, what you discovered doing your research was counter to your expectations, right? So for all of you, there were just surprises that you discovered. And one thing, this also came up too, one thing that revealed was who you were, what your standpoint had been going in. So I wanted to hear about that experience for all of you, but also how you adjusted your research methods when you encountered findings that were not what you expected, right? Did you have to change your method, your questions? How did you approach that?
Yeah, I can get started on this. I think when I first started this project, I came in with like climate change and health and two really broad categories of like where does this project even start? And I'm not sure when I realized, like, I don't think I came in initially knowing that there was this like huge historical element to it that would take me back to the 1960s and like anti-nuclear war activism, like, and climate change. You're like, how are those two things even threaded together? But it was really about, to some extent, like following the people. And like, I started with the medical journals, and like I was like, climate change and health, like what comes up? So it's really interesting to see, like, some people had, talked about this connection between anti-nuclear war activism, and then to actually find people like Alexander Leaf, who's an early founder of PSR, and then in 1989 goes on to like write this paper, and then in like 1991 or 1992, PSR also adopts like environmental and like climate change issues to its portfolio, and they're still active today doing that work. But then I think at some point I also realized like there is so much going on in medical schools today. Like I did not expect to see so much mobilization of students in medical schools, and like the targeting of medical school like education, and this goes on into like residency training and fellowship training, and kind of this like bottom up mobilization. And for that, yeah, speaking to like medical students was like key. I actually, where I met all these people was attending an in-person conference at Mount Sinai, the 5th Clinical Climate Change Conference back in June of 2023. And as like I mentioned in my presentation, like that was the day that New York had turned orange. There were all these reports about how New York and a lot of the Eastern Seaboard was being affected by Canadian wildfire smoke from like 300 miles away. And so that was where I met a lot of the people I, later interviewed, who connected me with people I would later interview, and, just get started in that project. But yeah. So some unexpected bits, and like, I think always talking to people was a great place to start, both here at Penn and elsewhere.
I can also follow up with that, because I think my project is extremely people-based, if anything else. And that's something that I didn't particularly know coming into the project. I knew I wanted to do something in family planning in Latin America. And then I had this almost not crazy idea, but I was like, what if I go back to Argentina, to what I had been doing the summer before, and kind of shift gears and think more towards a lot of the everyday conversations that I had with a lot of these women, right? I was very struck by women my age who had complete different life experiences, who I still could, we still had common interests, but like my life was completely different to theirs. And I think that was something that was really interesting when thinking about my own positionality within this research. I have a whole section on my thesis that kind of talks about how, I mean, first of all, I'm not even from Argentina. I grew up in Spain, so I have the Spanish in me, but it was, already extremely evident that my accent was very different to that of Argentina. Very much, I'm a 4th-year college student in the US, which already adds another layer to the kind of conversations I'm having with these women. And just kind of finding my way in and around Argentina was also a really exciting but terrifying experience at the same time. I was really lucky to have, again, a lot of people that were extremely supportive of this idea, because when looking at the research that had already been done, I was looking at, either prior to traveling to Argentina, I was looking at all these, New York Times, The Guardian, like all these big newspapers talking about how revolutionary this moment was, while also seeing an extremely big gap in research that didn't really amplify the voices that needed to be amplified, right? Like there was no research out there that really talked to and about the women and children that really were going through this family planning crisis. And so I think a lot of it came from like the genuine question of like, what do these people think about this? Like, how are they reacting to this social change? And thinking through how I could, better understand that. I think once I got to Argentina, I had one idea of how my project was going to go. And as research is, like, it completely shifted gears into something else. But that was kind of like on the day, on the job moment where someone said something that seemed somewhat interested in an interview, and you had to like jot it down and like think through and come back home and really like look through what that could mean. So there's no anticipation that you can go into it. Like you just have to be there and really like take it in and see how it develops, I think.
I think my comment builds up on that, especially because, at least regarding my project, while I am from Mexico, I'm actually from Mexico City. So I was going to explore a place that I know. Just the thing is that I don't know this specific community. Like Mexico City is a big city. I grew up in a different place. I didn't grow up in this like neighborhood. So it actually was my first time going there. So I think like the challenges that one faces when you go back to your home country, your home place to do research are kind of different to the ones that you face when you go to somewhere else. Because when you go to somewhere else, like you have some sense of freedom, I think. Like there is like, well, I'm not from here. I'm like just going around. I can stay here all the time I want. No problem. I can follow up people. And then like, everything is so new. But when you're already there and you already know kind of like how it works, then you have also some stigma about how things are, right? So this neighborhood that I went to is known for being like especially dangerous. So then there was like some first like that I think that was a boundary that existed that made it harder to sometimes communicate with people. I also had to be aware of what was going on. The first time I went there, also my mother actually went there with me. So we were both there exploring. So it was nice to have her because, well, she could be like looking around too. And then like I could be like talking to people for some more time. But at the same time, I think that was also made it harder, right? Because then I had to think about what she was doing, how she was doing as well. But I was not there alone, like just being able to, well, I want to stay here for 5-6 hours. And I had to actually care about someone else as well, right? About like maybe they just get bored. Like I am the person who's going to be here interviewing people, right? So, and well, not everyone likes that. So I think those are the things that I faced. Apart from also having some hardship finding sources, especially because this topic is relative new. There is not too much research already done about it. And if you ask like just people, random people that you know, like there are so many different perspectives. So it's kind of confusing at the beginning because not so many people know about this as well.
I first encountered the martial arts section when I was processing the Black Panther newspaper here at Kisak. And we only have a small minority of it. The vast majority of it is on a site called Marxist Archive. So if you're interested, you could check that out. And I think it's just very interesting, the practice of martial arts as an Asian practicing a Black nationalist group. And the difficulty is really trying to find out the appropriate framework to analyze it. So in my presentation, I talked a little bit about Orientalism, and in my full project, I used little bits of cultural hybridity by Baba. I also used Omi and Winant's racial project, and it's just challenging to trying to understand what does this mean for Black nationalist groups in general. And I think it's hard for me to reach general statements about that using such a small project, but I hope this could be a start that inspire more people to look at hybridity, not only in the sense of cultural, but what does it mean politically, and what does it mean racially? Because race is just a social construction, it has no biological basis. So what does this kind of racial project mean for our collective future? And what kind of racially harmonious society can we expect using this kind of information we find?
Yeah, I think we need to wait for a microphone, sorry, so that people online can hear.
I do apologize. I missed the presentation. I came late. However, I read your biography, Professor McKay, and when I walked in, you guys were talking about the role of the institution in making difference. But institution needs an individual that build it up. Reading your biography, you almost like you are an institution on your own. You're working Malawi, you're working home care worker. It's very essential thing. I wonder if you took on yourself and your work. Could you see yourself as an institution? And if you say so, could you you know what they say, the more the merrier? Could you add the home care, the sanitary workers, the trash worker to your work on the home care worker and the the domestic, because trash is very essential part of global warming. Handling the trash, minimize. Here in America, we throw trash and we throw cars in the trash. It's just. Do I have a question?
Yeah, sure. So having heard all these presentations about, well, as I said, like the insufficiency of institutions, I don't want to count myself as an institution in this context, but I think your question is really interesting. So, I mean, I think there's two parts of it. So like one, as I understand it, one is like, who is or what is the agent that produces knowledge? And is it like the individual researcher, or if I'm doing research with home care workers, like, how is that knowledge then something that we are producing together? Or what is the relationship between me, like we're in an institution, what is the relationship between like the people, the sort of like larger entities, and then the people that we do research with, and how do we make them visible in what we're doing? So that's one thing I hear in your question, is sort of like, how do we, maybe how could we be more strategic, or maybe I need to be more strategic in how we present knowledge as the outcome of like an individual research trajectory, rather than something collaborative that actually is involving all these people that we do research with. So that's like one thing that I really appreciate. And then your second point about trash, I think, yes, like, I think that's exactly right. So there's a feminist thinker named Françoise Vergès, who's from the Reunion Islands. I think she lives in France. But she has made this argument that cleaning and care work are the most essential sites for social and political analysis at this moment. Precisely because, as you say, like, everything we do involves the production of waste and the management of waste in some ways. And so often that is like outsourced and invisibilized, whether it's throwing things in the trash or whether it's discounting the work of the people who are doing that kind of cleaning work. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I really appreciate the push. And I think, yes, we could think of trash work as a site of health work and climate activism, and like also maybe political mobilization, or a site in need of political action. So I appreciate that. And that also sort of, I had a,
I just want to add that.
yeah.
Well, Charles Mills wrote an eloquent piece about black trash that talks about how marginalized communities are considered trash, being disposable, being harmful to society. As the environmental problem of the city, we certainly see a lot of racist rhetoric around that. So it's definitely about kind of positioning. And the institution is also, it's just a center of power. It's a center of agency, center of power. So I don't think I, as a person, is the institution because I don't have power. But what you can do and what you cannot do is the kind of question that centers a lot of our discourse.
Yeah, thank you, George. Well, I was going to ask a question to Dhivya, but if there are other audience questions, I've had lots of time at the mic. So. Oh, there's a microphone coming.
So this is to Charlie's project. So I have been fascinated by your project from the start, and I really like what you're doing. And I'm just wondering, so you describe basically how Black Panther Party use martial arts to address anxiety and so on and so forth. And I wonder what the normative uptake of your project is. I mean, I think it has extremely well description of what's happening, but do you think that the practice that they are engaging in by using some kind of Orientalism to combat social injustice and to address their anxiety and so on and so forth, do you think it's morally like permissible? Do you recommend it? Like, what's your normative conception of their project?
I don't usually kind of impose my own morality onto other people. So I recognize it as a phenomenon and I find it interesting. I don't judge, otherwise there'd be no way for a person like Africana Studies to do anything. But I think accusations surrounding appropriation is misguided. And I have stated in my presentation that it is really a larger framework of mutual appropriation and for their own political interests. So to accuse any party of appropriation, of using other people, I think it's inaccurate. And in reality, that's what people do, right? People use what they know, who they know for their political advantages. I don't think there is too objectionable about that is how we as a society function. So I personally, if anything, I appreciate the use of martial arts by the Black Panther Party, because I think it demonstrates tremendous strength in acknowledging something come from another racial group as a nationalist group. And it also raises an interesting question about the boundaries of indigenous knowledge. So what is the boundary? Is there a boundary? And in this case, I don't think that boundary is racially defined.
Okay, well, I'll ask Divya my question. So I was thinking about, and it sort of goes back to maybe the question about waste work as well. I was thinking about Joanna Crane and Claire Wendland, who you cited, and that one of the sort of problems that I think those books I address is the definition of global health in a way that is very much from a particular vantage point, American medical schools or US medical schools. And so I was wondering, in thinking about climate and medicine, are people grappling with the question of what, from where is climate change defined, or from what vantage point climate change becomes a problem? Or, so they talked to, you had quotes about research isn't always part of medical training. Are they also talking about what is climate, or from where do we know climate?
Yeah, I think maybe there's two answers to this. I think in part, there is a lot of recognition that, first of all, climate change disproportionately impacts certain types of communities. Those are low income, people of color, and I think most medical students, residents, physicians are also working in their local communities when it comes to climate change. And there is a lot of knowledge production, co-production, I would say, across with, physicians in the global north and global south, and other types of healthcare providers. But I think the interesting thing is that, at least to me, initially, it seems that there is kind of this one definition of climate change, okay, global warming, there's rising CO2, and we're thinking about CO2 emissions as kind of one of the main drivers. And so we're going to focus on reducing healthcare emissions broadly as kind of one facet of climate change and those health impacts. But I think the other thing that's happening, and something I'm still thinking about, is kind of how we think about climate change and planetary health, and the health of, I don't know if this is working. Oh, it is. Okay, great. Also the health of non-human organisms and more than human worlds as another kind of intersection or place for kind of healthcare professionals and others to interact, or maybe not interact, but think about when it comes to what we mean by health. I think that's still a kind of a work in progress of trying to understand how we think about kind of biodiversity, planetary health, and kind of the health of non-human others in the space. But yeah.
We have time for one more, if anyone has a last thought. Yes, we can. Okay, well, maybe we can give our panelists a big round of applause for these amazing projects. And thank you everyone for being here and for engaging in this great panel.